So, officially, welcome to our virtual tree ID session led by none other than Josh Kelly. My name is Cassidy Dunaway, and I am the AmeriCorps member at MountainTrue. I am the Outings and Education Coordinator, and so part of my jobs is setting up different activities like this. First, I should introduce MountainTrue. We're an environmental conservation organization that works regionally, mostly in Western North Carolina, to protect our resilient forests, our clean waters, and healthy communities. We do a lot of work with different organizations in the area, and we try to provide opportunities for community members to get involved with us and involved with the environment around us. Today, we're going to welcome Public Lands Field Biologist Josh Kelly. Josh will be covering the basics of tree identification in the Southern Appalachians. We will cover the terms and concepts that you will need to successfully identify trees in our area, no matter your experience level. This class will include a presentation, and we will have time for questions during and after. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll hand this over to Josh.
Thanks, Cassidy, and welcome everybody. Thanks for making time in the middle of the day to learn about tree identification. As Cassidy said, we're going to try to make this accessible for all different skill levels and knowledge levels about trees and tree identification. So I hope that folks that know a lot aren't too bored, and I hope that folks that are just getting started in learning how to identify trees don't feel left behind. And you know, if I do say something that you don't understand or don't hear correctly, or if I mumble or whatever, go ahead and put something in the question and answer or chat, and I'll try to answer your questions in real time and clarify things in real time. Also, we'll should have some time towards the end of the hour to discuss these topics in more detail if there's anything you'd like to look at in more detail. And let's see, it looks like I have started out at the end of the presentation. Let's start at the beginning. So yeah, we're gonna get started. We're focusing especially today on winter tree ID because it's wintertime, and you know, some of these concepts about leaves and things like that aren't going to be so helpful right now this time of year. We are going to cover, you know, summer growth traits as well, somewhat, but we're really going to focus on in particular bark, but also buds and twigs and overall tree form, different attributes of trees that you can use to identify them. We'll get started with the real basics here. Let's talk about gymnosperms. Gymnosperms, gymno means naked, sperms, seed. So gymnosperms are trees that do not have a seed coat. And most people know these as evergreens, even though some of these trees are not evergreen. For instance, bald cypress loses its needles in the wintertime. Larch as well loses needles in the wintertime. So some of these are deciduous, but they tend to be evergreen. They have cones, and they have seeds, like I said, without a seed coat. Other major type of trees that we have are angiosperms. You know, I could also talk about tree ferns, but we really don't have tree ferns here in the temperate world. If we were in the tropics, I might actually have to talk about tree ferns a little bit, which are neither angiosperms nor gymnosperms. But, you know, angiosperms, angio was covered, sperms, seed. So, you know, these are plants that have a seed coat, and, you know, people might think of these as, quote, normal trees. They have leaves instead of needles. They have, as well as seeds, some of them can have fleshy fruits or nuts that are either the fruits would surround the seeds, or the nuts would actually be the seeds. And these are generally deciduous, although there are some evergreen angiosperms, like, for example, the southern magnolia. When I'm out in the woods trying to identify trees, you know, I try to take in as much information as I can. And, you know, all these different things, leaves, branching, the buds on the trees, flowers, fruits, twigs, the bark, and the overall tree form are all really useful, as well as other cues like habitat, geography. You know, there's lots of different cues that are useful in identifying trees. So, this tree in this photo, I know it's a poplar, not just because it's huge, and poplars are some of the biggest trees in our area. I guess it may be a better term for this would be tulip tree, but around here we call these poplars. But I know it's a tulip tree because of the bark. I know it because of the form of the slow taper, etc. And so we're going to cover these different traits, and I'm going to encourage you to put together as many as possible when you are outside and puzzling over what tree you might be looking at. Let's start off with leaves. And if I was being exposed to this information for the first time, I would probably take notes. So if you are able to take notes, I would encourage that. So there are some basic terms that we use to describe leaves. One term we use is a simple leaf. So a simple leaf is a leaf that is not divided into little parts. It's just, a leaf. And you see a diagram of that. Now, leaves that are divided are either called compound or divided, and they can be divided many different ways. Pinnately compound is what you'll see most often, divided along a rachis. That central stem would be termed a rachis, and then with little leaflets off each side of the rachis. Now that whole structure is really one leaf. It functions as one leaf. It's derived from one leaf. If it's split more than once, it would be bipinnately compound. So you see that diagram of a bipinnately compound leaf on the top right. Another type of compound leaf would be a palmately compound leaf, which is like the palm of your hand. And so Buckeye would be the classic palmately compound tree leaf around here. There's a lot of other things to look at in leaves, but if you are out in the summertime or during the growing season, or even in the wintertime, you can pick leaves up off the ground and find that it's a compound leaf, and you're pretty sure that leaf goes with the tree you're looking at. That can be a really good clue. In addition to the number of divisions or lack thereof in leaves, leaf clues can include things like the margin of the leaf, especially. So whether the margin is smooth, which we call entire, or whether it is toothed, which is often called serrate or dentate. If you go through tree identification books, there will be different terms for the type of margins that there are. So, sawtooth type leaves are going to be called serrate. If you have really big teeth, they'll be called coarsely dentate. Lacinate would be another one for deeply toothed leaves. And undulate would be for a margin that is wavy, not really sharply toothed, but wavy. You can also look at things like the veins on leaves vary between species. So they can offer a lot of clues. Things like lobes and sinuses. So the margin may be entire, but it may have lobes that stick out and sinuses that dig in. So a good example of a tree with lobes and sinuses would be sassafras. Oak trees tend to have lobes and sinuses, as do maples. Things like glands on the petiole. The petiole is the structure that attaches the leaf to the main stem of the tree. And, structures like stipules, which are little leafy appendages, generally at the base of the petiole. And numerous other traits like the hairiness or lack thereof of the leaf, or if there's any waxy substances on the leaf, etc. In addition to leaf types, I think, and probably perhaps the most useful trait to look for in trees, if you're trying to decide what tree you're looking at, is to look at the branching style. And there are two main branching styles. Alternate branching, which is what is shown here, where the branches are alternating up the stem on the right side, and then the left side, and then on the right side, and the left side, etc. And then the other being opposite, where the twigs come off directly opposing, kind of like the arms on your shoulders. So most of the trees in our area are, of course, alternate, and most trees in general, but there are some opposite ones. And if you memorize those, you can stand a pretty good chance if you find an oppositely branched tree, of being able to identify it. So the main oppositely branched trees, native trees that we have in our area are maples, which include box elder, red maple, sugar maple, silver maple, mountain maple, and stripe maple. Ash, we have a couple of ash species in our area. Dogwood, the entire Caprifoliaceae family. So when I say Caprifoliaceae, that is the Latin name for a plant family that includes honeysuckles, includes viburnums, things like that. Buckeye, which we've already discussed having a compound, palmately compound leaf. Those are the main oppositely branched trees and shrubs in our area. There are a couple of more, like hydrangea, for example. Now, so gonna move on past branching, past leaves and simple versus compound. And if you have any questions about stuff like that, now would be probably a good time to raise any questions you have with that Q&A button. You should have. But if you don't have any questions, we'll move into bark, which to me is the most useful tree identification trait a tree has. In our area anyway. That's much more challenging in the tropics, where almost all trees have smooth bark. In our area, we have a variety of different bark textures, and the texture, color, etc. of bark can be really helpful in identifying trees. What I would recommend as far as using bark to identify trees is to use it in combination, though, with these other traits that we're learning. So you can become comfortable and confident in your bark identification skills. But so here's just some examples of some bark characteristics. So as far as texture, we've got smooth bark, American beech, classic for that. It's smooth and has very few textures on it. Musclewood, ironwood, for example, on the other hand, is smooth, but the wood underneath is very muscly, very ridged. A lot of trees in our area have cracked bark. So, for example, second to the right, that is a young hickory tree, probably a mockernut hickory from the looks of it, with vertical cracks in the bark. And those will eventually become structures known as furrows, and the high points will be known as ridges. Moving on, lenticels are huge. So lenticels are little openings in the bark. Lenticel is Latin for window. So, you'll see lenticels most commonly around here in birches, particularly yellow birch and sweet birch, but also in cherries like fire cherry, young black cherries, and the very common around here invasive Prunus avium. But also trees like aspens. Some oaks can show lenticels. And, trees in general may have, I guess I should say angiosperms may have occasional lenticels, but in trees like birch, they are abundant and what you would look for there. And in birch, they're horizontal lenticels. You see on the right-hand side, the cottonwood has more of a polygon-shaped lenticel. It's not like a horizontal line like it is in birch. So the shape of the lenticel can be a really good clue. So some of those trees with lenticels, like yellow birch on the far left, when they get older, the bark starts to peel. And so you can see that yellow birch still has lenticels, but as it gets older, you're starting to have peeling bark. And as it gets really old, you'll even have big peeling plates. You'll still be able to see the lenticels in those plates, but it won't look the same as it does on twigs or young trees.
Hey, Josh, we got a quick question.
Great.
Would you be able to point with your mouse at the tree you're speaking of?
Yeah, can you see my mouse? I've got my mouse on the yellow birch. So this is the yellow birch. And I was talking about, so the lenticels being, and that's a great, thanks for that suggestion, whoever sent that in. So the lenticels are these horizontal lines. But like I said, as the tree ages, you have peeling bark strips. And that's even more extreme in paper birch, which is the next picture, second from the left. Paper birch actually is native here. It occurs in the Smoky Mountains and in the Black Mountains. It's really a northern disjunct much more common up in the boreal forest. But because it was pushed down here in the Ice Age, and because we have really tall mountains with really cold temperatures, it's persisting on landslide scarves in some of those really tall mountains. So, some trees may have horizontal strips, others will have vertical strips. So in this case, we have a hop hornbeam, second to right where my mouse is cursoring over, and then on the far right, I believe this is a eastern red cedar. So being familiar with the kinds of peeling bark and what kind of peels they tend to make could be really helpful. So bark scales. Some trees tend to be scaly. A lot of pine trees tend to be pretty scaly, for example. Spruce trees, very scaly. So this over here is a spruce tree, I believe. This is a pine, and down here is a black cherry. Now, luckily, when you're out in the woods, you won't have to just look at the bark. You can look and see that this is an evergreen spruce tree or a pine tree with needles, and the cherry tree is going to have leaves or maybe not have leaves in the wintertime. The cherry in particular is so characteristic because it's dark colored. It's got the scaly textured bark, and really stands out once you start to recognize it. It's pretty easy to identify the black cherry in the wintertime. Another really easy one to identify all year round is the sycamore. The sycamore has this really white colored bark up on the limbs usually. The lower portion of the tree will be gray, but if you look high up in it, it's got these white, almost bony looking limbs. And this slide is described as plates. I don't know if I'd necessarily describe it as plates, but I suppose it would be. And then this looks over here like another pine tree that's breaking up into plates. Let's see, it looks like we might have another question.
Yeah.
Question is, what element and factors in the WNC landscape come together to create such a unique diversity of tree types? That's an awesome question. I'd like to come back to that at the end as you suggest. That's a great question. All right, moving on with bark. Yeah, so ridges and furrows, huge. There's a lot of trees with ridges and furrows, distinct ridges and furrows around here. Golly, again, the tulip tree being one of the more common trees around here has real distinct ridges and furrows. At the second from left is the tulip tree. And you can see at the base of the tree, those ridges and furrows are tightly netted. As you move up the tree, the ridges become more linear and long. Over here on the left, we have black locust. That's not a great photo of a black locust, honestly, to get a feel for the ridges and furrows, but black locust does have very distinct ridges and furrows. And as well as having a grayish, darker color to it. Here in the middle, we have a member of the red oak group. And I can tell it's a red oak because the ridges on red oak are smooth on the ridge surfaces. And you can see that. Some people describe them as ski tracks. So included in trees that are going to have those smooth ridges would mainly be northern red oak, but also scarlet oak around here. They have very different habitats. Northern red oak has pretty broad range of habitats, but tending towards moist areas. And whereas scarlet oak is going to be on drier ridges that have fire influence or a history of fire influence usually. And then a couple other examples, we've got black walnut and I believe box elder over here on the far right, all being very ridged trees. And again, these ridges change a lot with age. Younger trees tend to be smoother than older trees. And then very old trees can be either extremely ridged or sometimes the ridges will fall off and it will be smooth plates. So just be aware that all these bark characteristics change a lot with age and growing conditions, and that you can actually know something about the growth history of a tree, the age of a tree, if you get to really know these bark characteristics well. For a really extreme look at ridges and furrows, I will demonstrate to you this. So actually, let's be a little bit interactive in the Q&A. Who recognizes this tree? This type of tree. Notice that it's got really deep ridges, really big yeah, really high ridges, really deep furrows, and that the ridges break up into almost like a honeycomb pattern or hexagon pattern sometimes. It kind of looks like alligator skin. If anyone recognizes this, including Tony Ward, who's I know is on this call, this presentation, go ahead and put it in the Q&A.
You can also put it in the chat too. That'll work as well.
The chat or the Q&A. Have a really good guess from Dan Waterman of sourwood. Very close, but not quite. This tree can be confused with sourwood. It gets bigger. Persimmon, another great guess. So those are the two most common trees that would get confused with this tree. These get a lot bigger. Any other guesses? And so you know that persimmon and sourwood are in the right neighborhood. The other one that's in the right neighborhood is in the picture on the right. Oops, I need to go back. How do I do that? Go back to slide 15. So on the picture on the right in the background, that's a chestnut oak. So the trees that are commonly confused with this are sourwood, chestnut oak, and persimmon. And Tony Ward has it. Bing, bing, bing. It's a black gum. Yeah, so this is a black gum. Black gums are the oldest known tree in the Southern Appalachian Mountains. There have been individuals documented over 600 years old. They're often hollow, and because they're hollow, they were used for beehives. They were called bee gums back in the day. Because you could take a section of this, so you could cut one of these down that was hollow and section it up, and then put a little roof on it, and you'd have like a ready-to-go beehive. But so black gum is really characteristic when it gets old, in that it breaks up into sort of this alligator skin. It tends to have pretty deep furrows and pretty tall ridges. This is a really extreme one, this particular one, very extremely ridged. So that was a fun little interlude. Thanks for playing, everyone. We're going to move on now and talk about twigs. So, you know, when you're out in the wintertime and you look at the bark and you have a guess, but you're not sure, you can always look up at the twigs. You can look down on the ground at the leaves. You can find some other clues to help confirm what your suspicions are. So one of the things you can tell by the twigs is the branching style a tree has. You may not always be able to tell if a tree is opposite, because sometimes one of the branches may fall off and making it a pure alternate. But if you look hard enough and if you have access to a twig, you can always find the buds. So over here on the far left, we have a birch. Notice that the buds are alternate. This is your indication that this is an alternately branched tree. Also notice about birch, the buds are stalked. So the buds are actually, they extend up quite a ways from the twig. That's referred to as a stalk on the bud. And it's a really good clue that you've got a birch. The next twig, moving left to right, is ash. Notice that the buds are opposite on this tree. Also, notice the shape of the bud at the tip. That's called the terminal bud. The terminal bud can tell you a lot. So when I was learning winter tree ID, my teacher Irene Rossell told me that to her the buds on the ash looked like a Hershey's Kiss. Now, to me, they didn't really look like a Hershey's Kiss, but I still remember that. You know, everybody has their own way of remembering, and so maybe it looks like a Hershey's Kiss to you, but if you can find little tricks like that that can help you remember, it can be really useful. I think we're going to talk about leaf scars here in a minute, but I do want to point out that right below that terminal bud, you can really see the leaf scar on this ash tree. Hopefully my pointer is on that, and you can see the shape of that leaf scar, which is also diagnostic of ash. Next one over is a maple, also opposite. You've got the buds directly opposing each other. One is more developed than the other. Probably a red maple, because these buds are so red, but I'm not totally sure. And then, you know, there is a type of branching that that's not opposite or alternate that I did not discuss, which is whorled. It's actually kind of like alternate, but it's more than two branches coming off in the same spot. So if you have three or more branches, that's going to be a whorl. White pine is probably the most common whorled tree around here. It's actually the only native whorled tree I can really think of. And then, you know, beyond those buds and how they're oriented on the twig, you can look at look at the shape of the twig. So beech, for example, strongly zigzagged, as is sycamore. Another one that's a very rare tree around here that's very zigzagged is the yellowwood. Willow, on the other hand, is extremely straight. You'll find a lot of really straight, whippy twigs around here too. Gosh, there's so many different things you can look for on twigs, much like leaves. You know, you can look for if they're fuzzy or hairy, like this staghorn sumac on the far left. You can look and see if they're scaled or spotted, like, oops, I pushed the wrong button. Let me show you. Oops. Let's see, how do I? There we go. Sorry about that, folks. So like this black cherry here, I was getting to, you know, it has kind of scale, kind of a scaly texture. Not all of them will. Mulberry is going to have milky sap. There's going to be a certain number of trees around here with milky sap. Most of them are going to be kind of a clear latex, but mulberry has a very milky latex. You know, if the tree has thorns or spines or prickles like hawthorn, that's something to look for. Black locust being another one that has pretty strong thorns. You know, the color of the twig, like the red maple being so red, like I was talking about before. Whether they have wings or ridges like sweet gum. You know, there's only a couple of trees in our area that have wings on the twigs, sweet gum and winged elm being the two that I can really think of. And then really angular twigs. So blue ash is not a native tree, but it is a very angular, you know, four-sided twig. Blue ash occurs more towards the limestone areas up in the Ohio River Valley and out towards West Tennessee and places like that. You know, in addition to all these special twig characteristics, there's a couple others I'd like to mention. We can use all of our senses when we're doing plant ID or tree ID. So for example, the black cherry, if you break that twig and smell it, you're gonna get that burnt almond smell from the cyanide in the cherry. Birch, you know, particularly sweet birch, black birch, you break those twigs, you're gonna smell that root beer flavor, that birch beer flavor. You know, some of them, you can taste. Good example of that, although not necessarily the twig, but is a plant they call horse sugar. It's a woody shrub and tends to have its leaves in the wintertime, at least a couple, and you can taste those and they're going to be sweet. So now I would encourage you when you're able to use all your senses, you know, the touch, the sight, the smell, even the sound of how the twig breaks might be a clue, all of it. So if we get into twig anatomy, this actually, you know, when I do this again, I think I will reorder this slide and put it before the twig section that we just went through. But let's go over some twig anatomy. So starting at the top, we have the terminal bud, as I discussed before. We have the bud scales, which surround that bud. You know, below the terminal bud, any of those buds are termed lateral buds. Right below those buds, you'll probably see leaf scars. You know, there may be lenticels on the twig, those little holes in the twig. There is a ring surrounding some twigs. Not all trees show this strongly, but some show this very strongly. That would be a bud scar or bud scale scar. And whether or not that completely encircles the twig or not can be a real clue in identifying trees. So for example, the magnolias, we're talking tulip tree, Fraser magnolia, cucumber magnolia, umbrella magnolia, etc. They all have a scar encircling the twig. So it's something you can look for if you're unsure. And if you really get into leaf scars, you can start to look for the bundle scars in those. The bundle scars oftentimes require a hand lens or some magnification to see. Those are the vascular tissues. So basically the pipes that the tree used, kind of like the veins and arteries of a twig that they use to move liquid. And that can be really helpful if you're using a more advanced tree ID book. They'll sometimes ask you about those bundle scars. You know, other things that you might be asked about are the internodes. So the internode is that distance between the two buds, whereas nodes are areas where buds come out or leaves come out. So, and sometimes there will be questions if you're going through a tree ID key about the internode length or things of that nature. Let's see, it looks like we've got another question for the end. We'll save it for the end. So I'll get back here. Oh, I'm advanced here. I want to go back to Twig Anatomy. Finally, you know, inside the twig, you will be able to look at things like the pith, which is the center of the twig. Some trees have a hollow pith, like walnut. And additionally, in walnut, that pith is not only hollow, but it's chambered. So if you cut across that pith, you'll see little segmentations inside of it. A lot of piths are going to be solid. Some of them may have a soft tissue, may be solid, but might be very soft in the middle. And then, you know, you can also look at how the bark peels away from the twig if you were to cut a twig. Now, looking at buds here, gosh, again, there's almost endless variety to look at. Everything from shape to size to color to scaled versus unscaled. Lots and lots of different things to look at. And again, the buds can be great indicator of if you're looking at an alternate or an oppositely branched tree. So let's look at some buds. Over there on the far left, this is a really important one. Oaks, you know, collectively are the most abundant tree in the Southern Appalachians. We have a lot of different oak species. If you're not sure how to tell if it's an oak or some other kind of tree, one thing to look at is the terminal bud. Oaks almost always have clusters of terminal buds. They're just really crowded. You can see below that you strong, you know, alternate pattern. The oaks are alternately branched, but they're very clustered at the tip. So that's one way to tell oaks. And you can usually, if you have good lighting, look up into the crown and see those even in the wintertime. And if you can't see those with your unaided eye, you could bring binoculars in the woods with you. It could be really good tools for tree identification. You know, sugar maple, you know, you might say, oh gosh, these are really, really clustered. They are, but not as much as the oak. And you can also see the shape difference is just so striking, where that terminal bud is so much bigger than those lateral buds. Buckeye, great example of a tree with huge twigs, really big buds. And why do you think they have big twigs and big buds? And this is a trend you'll see. Just think about that. Why would a buckeye have big twigs and big buds? Well, the reason it has big twigs and big buds is because it has big leaves, big compound leaves. Compound leaves tend to be large and tend to lead to the need for a twig that can support those and the buds that are going to hold that developing tissue. So that's a general trend, is that trees like you know, buckeyes, walnuts, hickories, ash, etc., that have compound leaves tend to have bigger twigs than other trees in the forest. But buckeye is a really good example of imbricate scales. So most trees around here are going to have imbricate scales, including this maple. You can see them very clearly in the sugar maple, including oaks. And that just means overlapping scales, kind of like shingles, overlapping shingles. There are a handful of trees around here that have other styles. You know, probably the most unusual would be trees with naked buds. And so naked buds do not have any scaled coverings, any shingles. And so bitternut hickory, this tree here that my cursor is over with the yellow, you can almost see the leaf structure here. The little fingers at the tip of the buds are those compound leaves in early development. And they have a yellow fuzz on them, but they have no scales. Also, the tulip tree, this is known as valvate buds. A lot of the naked buds are valvate, where you can see two bud scales coming together like so. And almost looks like two hands praying. Sycamore, on the other hand, has a cap-like appearance. You don't see those overlapping scales, but you see this cap-like appearance. And so this is another one that you might develop some sort of some sort of association with. I'm not quite getting what that might remind me of, but it's pretty unusual, that sycamore shape. It looked like we had another question or two come up. Oh, maybe it is this. We had a comment. I think the sycamore looks like Hershey's Kisses. Maybe that is the one that looks like Hershey's Kisses. So yeah, that's a good one. All right, moving on. And we are racing through this. We probably have plenty of time for questions at the end here. You know, some more types of buds that are very recognizable. Dogwood. You know, so dogwood is an oppositely branched tree, so you could probably find those opposite twigs. You might recognize the bark as being light color with a little bit of texture, almost sometimes a scaly appearance. But the terminal bud is a flower bud. It's huge. American beech, long and pointy. Bitternut hickory, we talked about it. Valvate, naked bud. Pignut hickory, you can see it is overlapping imbricate scales. Here we have brown onion. Oh, that's an interesting. How about that? Does that look like an onion? Maybe so. I don't know. I'll also point out, look at the stout twig, real thick twig on this hickory. Red maple, red twig, red bud, rounded bud. That's a good one. How about the stegosaurus tail for oaks? I don't know. You know, that's a really good one. I wouldn't have thought it. I probably would have gotten that better when I was 10 years old than now when I'm 40 years old. And finally, the tulip tree, a duckbill, maybe so. I don't know. You know, any of these sort of associations you can make will probably help you remember what kinds of trees you're looking at. All right, yeah, we'll talk about leaf scarves here. So again, you have these lateral buds, and below the lateral buds, you've got these scars. And the shape of those scars and the orientation can tell you a lot about what you're looking at. So like this tree here, which is probably a walnut, not totally sure, has these 4 bundles, right? And whereas this tree here, I'm not sure what this one is, has a circular set of bundles. This maple here has 3 bundles. So the number of bundle scars and their orientation, the shape of the leaf scar can tell you a lot if you want to get into that. You know, honestly, I don't usually end up having to use leaf scars in our area. I seem to be able to find enough other traits to use. But if you are using a tree identification guide, it's good to be able to know this terminology because you will be asked these questions a lot of times. So yeah, let's look at some types of tree and their scars. Let's see. Any questions? I saw a new one. So on the far left, tree of heaven is one of our most noxious invasive trees. Very common in our area, unfortunately. Compound leaf. And sumac. They're both in the same family, actually. They have similarly shaped leaves. They look similar in appearance when the tree of heaven is shrub size. But you can see the leaf scar and the bundle scars are much different. So on the left, tree of heaven, you know, very large scar, kind of a big V-shaped with very prominent bundle scars, whereas the sumac, much smaller scar. Let's see here. Oh, messed up again. Wish I could move this thing. Let's see. I'm hoping that you all aren't seeing what I'm looking at here at the bottom. Well, this fuzzy twig here, gosh, I see, I'm trying to remove my my slide advancer because I am not able to see what the caption says there. Oh, almost there. Almost. We'll skip the fuzzy twig and go on to monkey face. So, oh, that's a black walnut. I see now. Yeah, black walnut. So they say that the monkey face on the black walnut. That makes sense. Anyway, yeah, mnemonics like that can help you. You also notice how fuzzy the twig is. Lots of different clues in the black walnut. And then moving over to the ash species. So here we have 2 different ash. One is native here, Fraxinus americana. Fraxinus nigra, that's a much more northern upper Midwest species. And look how different those leaf scars and bundle scars are. So if you're, you know, happen to be in Minnesota and didn't know if you had a black ash or a white ash, that could be a great clue for you. Moving over, catalpa, very cool tree, beautiful flowers, commonly planted ornamental, very distinctive leaf scar and bundle scar. And then finally, sycamore over here. I believe the leaf scar and bundle scar for the sycamore is almost in a little very thin, almost semicircular structure around those buds. That's pretty distinctive as well. So let's go through a few trees and their traits and some of the things you will notice when you're trying to identify them. So here we have a white pine, dark bark, flaky, has oftentimes a sap that you'll find dripping. Most importantly, you're going to find when you're looking at pines, you want to look at their needle bundles. White pine is the only pine in our area that has needles in bundles of 5. And the trick that is being suggested here is that white has 5 letters, and so there's 5 needles in each fascicle, each bundle. Looks like we had a question come up. Okay. Move on to American beech. American beech is a very smooth bark tree. We talked about that. We talked about the buds being long and pointy and imbricate, overlapping scales. Look at the beech nut. How about that? You could probably recognize that nut with those structures coming off of the shell of the nut there. And leaves. If you happen to have the leaves, you've got the serrate or dentate leaves, very pointy. Pretty good size points on those leaves. This is obviously an angiosperm, it's alternately branching, etc. One of the things about beech that's pretty neat is you walk around in the woods in the wintertime and it's holding onto its leaves, holds onto its leaves almost all winter long. All right, red maple. Red maple, yeah. Oops, let me go back here. Red maple, probably the most abundant tree in Eastern North America. Red maple is a jack of all trades, can grow in very shady environments, can grow in dry places, wet places, and everywhere in between. When it's small, has pretty smooth bark. When it's old, it can have very long strips, can be much more dark colored. And in the wintertime, you're going to find red buds and red twigs in this tree. And when it gets closer to flowering, those buds swell. After it flowers, it sets seeds, and those seeds are also red. And in the fall, when the leaves change color, they are very red. So it's a red tree in all seasons. Really well-named tree. Opposite branching, like all maples, has lobes on the leaves. And it has, very importantly, V-shaped sinuses. Some of the maples have V-shaped and some of them have U-shaped sinuses. So these are V-shaped sinuses here. Sugar maple and silver maple have U-shaped sinuses. The other maples in our area have V-shaped sinuses. American sycamore, a great tree, real stately, big tree. Look at those white branches like I was talking about, shining in the sun. Has these ball-shaped fruits. And leaves that are much like a maple leaf, lobes and sinuses. But look how many more lobes that you're going to have on this sycamore, and look how large the leaves are. The leaves are much bigger than a maple, and they're also not oppositely branched, they're alternately branched. All right, and redbud. Great little shrub of a tree in the bean family. Look at the beans on it. Unlike most of the bean family, it is just one leaf, or appears to be one leaf. Evolutionarily, what's happened here actually is that you had a compound leaf that was, for some reason, got down to just 2 leaflets, and those leaflets refused into one leaf that looks like a heart-shaped leaf. So, it's going to key out as a simple leaf. Evolutionarily, it went to a compound leaf and evolved back to being a simple leaf. Pretty fascinating. And of course, it's got these beautiful pink flowers. Finally, I want to talk to everybody about identification by Gestalt. This word Gestalt is something you'll hear a lot with folks who study natural history. You'll ask somebody how they know what something is, and they'll say, "Oh, I know it by Gestalt." It can sound a little, I don't know, a little offhanded, a little, maybe a little dismissive or arrogant sometimes, but really, Gestalt is an important thing. It comes from the German meaning from form or shape. So you're looking at the overall form or shape or something. So if you're identifying by Gestalt, it's a more intuitive process that you're using all the different pieces of a whole to make an identification. You know, and Gestalt can be really important. It's, you know, if you're making maple syrup like I am right now, you know, it's good to know that that big tree on the left here is a red maple, while this smaller tree on the right is a sugar maple, because that red maple only has half the sugar content as the sugar maple. So, you know, and how do I know that that's a red maple and that's a sugar maple? Well, I know because of the darker color on the red maple. I know because of the narrow vertical strips. Sugar maple can have vertical strips as well when they get old, but they're much wider. I know by the black coloration on the sugar maple. This black coloration comes from insects and sapsucker woodpeckers feeding on this tree, and then the sap becoming oxidized and forming a black, you know, surface covering of the tree. I know there's a lot of different ways. You know, I could look up and look at the twigs and see that the twigs were much more red on the red maple. And obviously, if there were any leaves on the trees, that'd make it a lot easier as well. But the kind of thing, you know, determining trees can be important. It's particularly if you work with wood in any sort of way or do any sort of land management or forestry, or, you know, even if you are thinking about the kinds of trees in your yard and which ones to cut down and which ones to keep. These are, you know, identifying trees is really practical for a lot of reasons. For the rest of this hour up until about 1 o'clock, you know, I guess we can have time for questions, and I have a couple already queued up here. So the first question we got from Robert, I don't think I can pronounce French very well. It looks like a French name, Priolo, is what elements and factors in the Western North Carolina landscape come together to create such a unique diversity of tree types? Yeah, great question. So, you know, Western North Carolina is in the Southern Blue Ridge Mountains, which is a subset of the Appalachian Mountains. And the Southern Blue Ridge, it is a mountain range that's very old, and it's very complicated geology, and has very tall mountains. You know, generally speaking, when you look at conservation biology or natural history, evolution, whatever, mountains tend to be more diverse than non-mountainous areas. Mountains create a diversity of elevations, which is a surrogate for temperature. They tend to attract or produce a lot of moisture, which is good for diversity. They tend to have lots of different aspects. So north, south, east, west, and those north, south, east, west aspects get different sun exposures and have different temperatures. And in the case of the Southern Blue Ridge, our mountains are in a place in North America where they have never experienced glaciation. So lots of North America has had glaciers on top of it for periods of time, and glaciers tend to scrape life off the landscape. So the Southern Blue Ridge has been a refuge for trees and all sorts of organisms from the north, as well as a place where in hot periods, trees from the south come up and colonize. And then because of our topographic complexity and the type of microclimates we have, these trees and other plants and animals are able to persist even during ice ages. So it's a really big mixing zone and an area of great interaction, you know, in North America. So basically, it's the complexity, it's the landscape complexity and the deep history that allows our area to have more species of trees than the entire continent of Europe, for example. Next question. We live in the Brevard area. Do you know if there is a place anywhere in my area where they have some type of place to go where my family can walk through the forest and try to identify the trees and then have an answer key to see if we are correct or not? We have no way of knowing if our guesses are ever correct. I hope that makes sense, what we were asking. Thank you. Yes, Quinn, that does make perfect sense. And there are some places around here where you can do that. I think the North Carolina Arboretum near Bent Creek, where the parkway crosses the French Broad River, is probably Best known place, another great place for that is the Botanical Gardens at Asheville. Has a lot of labeled trees. There is another, the Bullington Gardens, I believe, is a spot in Henderson County that also has, labeled landscaped area where you can, practice some tree identification. And there are probably a lot more. I'm not sure if Brevard College has any resource like that or not. I'm not sure how much there are labeled trees around, say, the Pisgah Wildlife Center, et cetera. But what I would encourage you to do, Quinn, is to go to some of these places, but also just to keep guessing, keep practicing. I would also encourage you to have a tree identification guide of some sort with you when you go in the woods and make some guesses. And I think the more you guess and the more information you take in and use, the better and better your guesses will get. Question from Ryan Hinkleman. Can I talk 1 minute about Western North Carolina and gathering maple syrup? Sure. So yeah, maple syrup, Ryan, is not new to this area. People traditionally made maple syrup for a while around here, but I think as the economy got more globalized, there's just a lot more maples up north. And so people up north have a kind of more of an economy of scale in making maple syrup, but sugar maple is one of several trees in our area that you can make syrup out of. It just happens to be the most concentrated. The ratio is about 40 gallons of sap to 1 gallon of syrup. The time to tap is basically when you have conditions where it's getting down below freezing at night, and then you're having sunny days during the daytime. Around here, we start tapping trees in January. Further north, it's much later. Around here, you're done before March. What happens as the season progresses is the trees start to not only move sap, but they start to make their buds start to swell. And as their buds swell, they're making chemicals that actually make those buds, make the flowers, make the leaves. And those chemicals do not taste good. It's not just the pure sugar, not just the pure sucrose and glucose and fructose. But if you're interested in making maple syrup, there's a lot of information online about that. And it's a fun little thing to do, especially if you have a wood stove and you can boil a lot of the sap on your wood stove. Steve asked, do we ever have tree ID hikes? Yes, we are going to have a hike this Saturday, but because the United States is not able to act collectively and keep our coronavirus numbers low, we didn't feel it was safe to have public gatherings. But we will have more tree ID hikes in the future. We've had them in the past, and we will definitely have some in the future. Question about getting a copy of the presentation. Absolutely. We will both have a link up to this recording online. Well, actually, we may not be recording. We may have forgotten to record this. I'm not sure.
I've been recording.
Oh, good. Cassidy's on it. So yes, we'll have a recording of this presentation, and we can get you a PDF of the presentation. And Vicki also has a question. As a homeowner, I was told by a friend to get rid of any honey locust because they shoot up like weeds. Do you agree? Are there some locusts that would be worth keeping? I disagree personally. It depends on the context. Honey locusts have very large thorns. They have these large compound thorns, so they'll have, it's almost like a cross, and they are pretty imposing. So if they're in a spot where those thorns are going to cause you trouble, I can understand. But honey locusts are great trees. They have wonderful flowers, great for pollinators. They're the beans they make are huge. They're these huge dark colored beans in the fall, and you can open those up, and every one of the seeds has a fleshy coating on it that's edible and delicious, in my opinion. Very sweet. And there's a lot of traditional dishes Native Americans made out of those. I think the wood is somewhat useful as well, pretty hard wood. And then finally, they're not very common in our area. Actually, one thing that I have heard, and I believe it to be true, is that when you find honey locusts, there's a couple of things going on. One for sure, as a biologist, I can tell you they like very fertile soil. So they're often in river bottoms. But the other thing, if they're naturally occurring, is oftentimes they're naturally occurring around Native American villages because they were valued by Native Americans as a food tree. So I think they're really interesting, and I would not try to eradicate them around here personally. Let's see. Question from Quinn: do trees only bud in the spring or all year long? Yes, trees have buds all year long. the buds swell large in the spring, but even in the summertime, there will be buds that are developing on the tree that will be there. Bruce Roberts asked, can you recommend a good book for winter tree identification in our area? Yes, there are a lot of really good tree identification books, but it kind of depends on your skill level. A couple that are very good for folks who are not scared off by complicated, for books that have a glossary that you have to look up terms in. There's a book on winter tree ID for trees and shrubs of the Smoky Mountains. And then there's a book, Ron Lance has a book, Woody Plant ID of the Southeastern US or something like that. And that's a very good book. It's got like 400 species in it and covers everything from the Ozarks down into Florida. But other books like Peterson's has a field guide of trees. I believe Audubon does as well. There's a really good book, Trees of Georgia, and more. There's a lot of good books, and there's also a lot of great online resources. North Carolina State University has a great website for identifying trees. If you were to do an internet search for tree identification website, that would be great. There are apps like Plant Finder, and I've heard what Dendrology Doctor or something like that. Good apps. I really like iNaturalist, not because it's perfect at identifying things, but because it's a great way to document the diversity in an area. But iNaturalist actually has really good image recognition software, and if you take a picture of a leaf, iNaturalist is very likely to tell you what kind of tree. So there's all sorts of options for resources for identifying trees. Books and digital. Let's see, question from Paul Curtin. What trees are good for long-term ground contact to build structures like steps or cribbing outside of black locust? Great question, Paul. So it depends. Trees that, it's interesting, trees that get wet and then dry out and then get wet, that's the hardest thing. So if they were to stay wet all the time, they'd actually probably last longer, or stay dry all the time, obviously, that they last longer. But hemlock actually, is becoming endangered around here because of hemlock woolly adelgid, but hemlock is one that's pretty moisture resistant. Another couple that are moisture resistant that are very expensive and have moisture resistant heartwood are black walnut and black cherry, both very rot resistant. And then after that, there's sort of a gradation. Oaks are okay, poplar's not good. Maple doesn't tend to hold up. Ash tends to rot pretty quick if you expose it to water. So kind of a gradation. But yeah, ideally you get locust would be the primo rot resistant native wood. The most primo in North America, north of Mexico, is probably Osage orange, but that's a rare wood around here, and it's very valuable for a lot of different things. So you may not want to use it in a building. It'd be hard to find one big enough to. Another question from Robert. I believe a serviceberry tree is growing on a rocky slope outside of Brevard. Are those native to the area? Yes, there are several native serviceberries in the area. The two most common ones are Amelanchier laevis and Amelanchier arborea. Arborea being more of dry habitats and laevis being more of moist habitats and higher elevation habitats. And then there are some shrubs, in particular Amelanchier sanguinea. Frank asked if there's any recommended guide or app for ID. I already went over that. I wouldn't be able to just recommend one because it really depends on your personal interests and level of experience. But there are a lot of options. Again, Trees of Georgia, good local one. Peterson's great. I think I missed Sibley's good. Audubon, and then some of those more erudite ones like Ron Lance's Guide to the Woody Plants in the Southeast. Julie asked, what is your favorite type of tree to find when hiking? Oh gosh, beautiful trees, the pretty kind, any of them. It's hard to even pick a favorite tree for me, but I oftentimes really like old trees or large trees. And someone asked, what's the best time of year to identify trees? I'll say the easiest time is the summer because you have more clues. But the best time is anytime you're outside. My good friend Lou Lieb asks, how or where does a new branch develop as opposed to a leaf? Lou, yeah, branches, just like leaves, they develop from buds. So oftentimes a bud will actually have, a shoot inside of it as well as a leaf. So a bud could produce both a shoot and a leaf. So actually buds are known as stem cells. Actually, they can form any kind of plant tissue. So they're not necessarily determinant of a leaf versus a shoot. Let's see. And one last question. It's 1 o'clock. I think we're about over, but Dan asks, I have a couple of service berries. Do you have any tips on how to encourage growth? Let me know. Yeah, so it depends. If you want the trees to grow fast, you could fertilize them a little bit. But fast growth isn't necessarily the best thing for trees. Trees that grow fast tend to not live as long as trees that grow slow and steady. For fruiting, I would say phosphate would be something you might want to consider. Phosphate tends to encourage and improve flowering and fruiting. So you may consider adding some phosphate to your service berries. And that's about it. I really appreciate everybody showing up on a weekday over lunch, and had a good time. Hopefully next time we can have maybe an in-person gathering or more of a discussion, but really appreciate everybody. And thank you, Cassidy, for organizing this.
Thank you all for coming, and you can look for this recording on YouTube and the next couple days on our MountainTrue YouTube page. So thank you all. Bye.